The Blue Beetle movie comes out today, and you may be surprised to know that Jaime Reyes, the character in the movie, is the third Blue Beetle, a character from DC Comics. But he's not the first Blue Beetle, and the first one wasn't a DC Comics character, nor was the second one. Let's look at some of the origins of Blue Beetle and also the very popular character Peacemaker from Charlton Comics. Let's do a rundown on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hey there, panelologists. This is Jim from Bronzeville Comics coming to you with another video. And before we get started, like, comment, subscribe, do all that great stuff. I appreciate it. Give us a follow on Instagram at Bronzeville_comics. Also on Whatnot, Bronzeville_comics. If you sign up for Whatnot using the link in the description, you'll get some money off your first purchase. Also in the description of this video is a link to my eBay store as well as my email. So with all that out of the way, the Blue Beetle movie is premiering today. And I'll be seeing it tomorrow. So I haven't seen it yet. There is some positive advance word. But there are very tempered expectations when it comes to the box office from Warner Brothers, and people are saying another bomb on their hands. We'll see. And we'll see how this connects to the rest of the DC universe. Now, the character that Zolo Madreña is playing in the movie is Jaime Reyes, who is the third character to take on the Blue Beetle mantle. Each of them are a little bit different. And the first two are characters whose costumes we saw in the trailer. And they both have origins, not with DC Comics, but with the Charlton Comics. And actually, the original Blue Beetle goes back even before that. So I want to talk about Charlton Comics and some of the keys and first appearances, especially for characters that DC still has the rights to. Some that we've seen on the big or small screen and some that we have yet to. So let's just take a look. So Charlton Comics, Charlton was a publishing company that in the mid-1940s began a comic book line. And their first comic book was Yellow Jacket #1, which came out in September of 1944. And Yellow Jacket was a character who used bees to help him fight crime, which I think had already been done by Quality with the Red Bee, but that's an entirely different story. Actually, I guess Yellow Jacket really used wasps. And there would be another Yellow Jacket by Marvel. So we really haven't seen Yellow Jacket since that Golden Age series went away. And at that time, superhero popularity was waning. And so by the time they got to the 1950s, Charlton was moving in other directions. They started to acquire titles and sometimes backlogged stories and artwork from other publishers, including Fawcett Comics, which had published Captain Marvel, aka Shazam. However, they didn't continue that character or any of the other superheroes that Fawcett had. They were more focused on war, romance, and horror. And what's interesting is, and also some super heroic animals. They had an Atomic Mouse comic that came out in 1953. Later on, they had Atomic Rabbit. But really, there were a lot of pre-code horror films. And one of the artists who worked for Charlton at the time was Steve Ditko, who would go on to co-create Spider-Man over at Marvel Comics with Stan Lee. And Steve Ditko is an important part of Charlton Comics history. His first comic book cover dated February 1954, is The Thing #12, which is definitely pre-code horror. There were some of the Charlton books are mentioned Seduction of the Innocent, and some of them have very graphic, horrific covers. Interestingly, I think they're a little bit underappreciated. For instance, that Ditko book, The Thing, had been a book that premiered in 1952, probably the title inspired by the Howard Hawks film starring James Arness. And it was 1954, issue number 12, that Ditko got his first cover work. And then, interestingly, I think this is, in general, the Ditko horror books by Charlton are a little bit underappreciated in terms of pre-code horror. And I don't see them featured too often. And they're not, I don't think, as desired as some of the EC or even some of the Atlas titles and some other less well-known publishers. So they got into the horror. Ditko did several covers, including a classic cover for the title Space Adventures 12 in and around 1954. And he continued to work for Charlton, as well as later on doing work for Marvel. And in the meantime, Charlton was publishing war books, and they were publishing a lot of romance books, which were very long-lived, like My Little Margie and Love Diary. Those lasted for quite a while. But interestingly, in the Silver Age, they started to get into the superhero game. And they got into the superhero game even before Marvel Comics did. Writer Joe Gill and artist Steve Ditko, in Space Adventures number 33, which cover dated March 1960, this predates Fantastic Four 1 by over a year, created the character of Captain Atom, who was very much in the vein of the 1950s superheroes, Captain Comet, for instance, with DC Comics, that kind of more sci-fi and atomic age based. He would appear in several issues of Space Adventures before taking essentially a 3-year hiatus before he was seen again. Charlton returned more full force into the superhero game in 1964 with the publication of Blue Beetle number 1. Now, Blue Beetle number 1 was the reprise of the Golden Age character, Blue Beetle. Dan Garrett, his power source changed throughout the Golden Age. From early on, he was just a regular costume crime fighter without any powers. He did develop powers later on. And his self-titled series, which was published by Fox Features Syndicate, sort of towards the tail end of the 40s, as superheroes were decreasing in popularity, it turned more into kind of a romance book, and there are some very popular good girl art covers towards the end of the line, as opposed to straight superheroics that you had seen earlier in the decade of the 1940s. So then Charlton started to come back with some of their some other titles. Captain Atom was getting new stories by 1964. In December of 64, they published, and I bring this up not because it's a superhero, but Sarge Steele number 1 was a private detective with a metal hand. That's a character that has continued to be used. And we'll come back to this. In May of 1965, in Mysteries of Unexplored Worlds number 46, the son of Vulcan made his first appearance. He has appeared sporadically over the years. He is a reporter who's a veteran of the Korean War but had lost a leg, is mystically summoned by the gods of Olympus, and when he summons Vulcan, he gets the superpowers of this Greek god. Or maybe it's a Roman god because he's dressed more like a Roman centurion. Anyway, son of Vulcan, then shortly after that got his own self-titled series. In November of 1965, Charlton was publishing war books. In Special War Series number 4, we saw the first appearance of Judo Master. This is a character that was adapted into a different version of the character by the same name in the Peacemaker TV series, which has increased the value of this particular book. In January of 1966, Thunderbolt came out, written and drawn by Pete Morisi, who did manage, he only licensed the property to Charlton at the time, and later on his estate did license it to DC, but he has had books published by other publishers, including Dynamite. And if you are familiar with the Golden Age Daredevil character, you can see that Thunderbolt's costume is very similar, and Morisi had worked on Daredevil with Lev Gleason Publications during the Golden Age. So that's the beginning of 1966. By the end of 1966, Ditko was doing the penciling work on Captain Atom. In September of 66, in Captain Atom number 82, they debut the character Nightshade. And then the very next issue, in issue 83, November of 66, we see the first appearance of Ted Kord II, or Silver Age Blue Beetle. And we'll talk more about that character going forward in just a minute. The very same month, in another war book, Fightin' 5, issue number 40 was the first appearance of Peacemaker. And I think most of us are familiar with how popular John Cena has made that character, both with his appearance in the Suicide Squad movie, as well as his own self-titled series on HBO, which will continue. And then in 1967, in March of 67, Peacemaker got his own series. Judo Master would get his own series. Blue Beetle got his own series in June of that year. And a backup, also a character written and drawn by Steve Ditko, premiered The Question. So you have a bunch of first appearances of characters that are still in use today in that 1964 to 1967 period. However, by the end of 1967, Charlton was no longer interested in making superhero stories, and they canceled the superhero titles. They were continuing the romance books, the horror books, and by the early 70s, they had added some more horror titles like Ghostly Haunts, Haunted. They already had The Many Ghosts of Dr. Graves, and they were also acquiring intellectual property based on movies, TV series, and in many cases, children's TV series, Saturday morning series like the Flintstones, the Jetsons. They licensed characters with newspaper strips. They had Beetle Bailey comics, Flash Gordon, The Phantom, Popeye. They would adapt other TV series, live action, $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman, as well as cartoons like Grape Ape and Hong Kong Phooey. I also have one-shots of movies. They even had a short-lived Ronald McDonald comic book. And they did try to create some more superheroic characters in the early 70s. In 1973, E-Man #1 appeared with art by Joe Staton. A character that bounced around in the 70s and 80s. But none of those comics really have much value. One thing you have to watch out for if you're going to collect these books, they did a series of reprints in around 1976, 77, 78. The covers look exactly the same as the Silver Age books with one difference. In the 1970s reprint books, they're under the Modern Comics banner, and you'll see in the upper left-hand corner of the book is a big blue circle with white lettering that says Modern Comics. Those are not worth nearly as much as the Silver Age counterparts. The one thing that's tricky about the Silver Age books is the numbers are printed really, really small, and you have to kind of make sure you look close and squint to see what the actual issue number is. That happened to me when I came across a collection that did have the first appearance of Peacemaker. I'm Fighting 5, and I didn't at the time automatically recognize the cover. And I'm looking, and my eyesight is not what it used to be. I was looking to see what the issue number was, and sure enough, it was the issue that I was looking for, number 40, the first appearance of Peacemaker. And they did try to debut some other characters, tried to think about reviving the superheroes, but nothing really came of it. Then in 1983, now Dick Giordano, who worked as an artist for DC. He was mostly as an inker. He did do pencils. He was the inker on the Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil run of Green Lantern, with the Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Hard Traveling Hero storyline. And that came about after the superhero line was done at Charlton. He worked for Charlton. I think he was the editor of the superhero line, at least. He also penciled the first several issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And Dick Giordano was kind of a big player in DC Comics. In 1983, he was able to, I guess, work a deal, and this sounds like a pretty good deal, where DC bought the Charlton characters for $5,000 per character. A pretty good deal, all things considered. And then DC, this was right before Crisis on Infinite Earths. They make their first appearance, many of these characters, in, I believe it's Crisis number 6. So many of those heroes, as well as the villains from the Charlton comics, were rolled into DC continuity. Prior to Crisis, they were from Earth 4, and then they became part of the main Earth. And DC very quickly launched brand new ongoing titles for Blue Beetle and Captain Atom. They did have a Peter Cannon Thunderbolt miniseries, or maybe it was an ongoing series, the last 12 issues. There was a Peacemaker miniseries at the time. And The Question got his own series, which is a really good read, by the way. Denny O'Neil and Dennis Cowan, I believe, did that run. Much recommended if you can find it. You can usually find those books on the cheap and back issue bins. But they might have gone another direction with those characters, because Alan Moore wanted to use those characters when he was writing the Watchmen storyline for DC. I think if they did it now, they just make it an Elseworlds story with the same characters. But if you've either read the Watchmen comic book, which you haven't, I recommend even more highly than The Question. It is an essential reading in comic books. Or you've seen the movie, maybe the TV show. The TV show still has some of the original characters. Each of the main characters in Watchmen is based on an analog from Charlton Comics. Dr. Manhattan, Captain Atom. Ozymandias is based on Peter Cannon, Thunderbolt. Night Owl is based on Blue Beetle, and he's Night Owl too. You even notice he has an owl ship, which is like the Beetle ship that Blue Beetle has. The Comedian is based on Peacemaker. Silk Spectre is based on Nightshade, and in the comics there was a romantic relationship at the time. It might have been a very muted one because it was Silver Age, between Nightshade and Captain Atom. And then finally, the Rorschach character is based on The Question. So what DC didn't, they wanted to use the characters in ongoing projects. So they didn't want Alan Moore to like just kill all of them and you know, change the trajectory of those characters. So they created the Watchmen series. And if you're familiar at all with the Charlton characters and you read or watch Watchmen, you'll know who's who right away. So in Blue Beetle, in the trailer, there's a shot where you can see that when they're in the Beetle, they're actually in the Beetle that was created by Ted Kord. You can see in the background the original Dan Garrett costume and the Ted Kord costume. And Susan Sarandon's character in the Blue Beetle movie is Victoria Kord, the sister of Ted Kord. So there are key books you can pick up by Charlton, and they're usually overlooked. And I think you could also, if you're a pre-code horror fan, you get some really cool covers for values less than specifically some of the EC titles. You could get some early Ditko work as well. Not what I would refer to as cheap, but more affordable than some of the other pre-code horror books. So if you're going to go see Blue Beetle, keep in mind that the antecedents came from Fox Features Syndicate with the original Blue Beetle. The second Blue Beetle, Ted Kord, was part of Charlton Comics run, and then Jaime Reyes was a character that was created in DC Comics by Jeff Johns and Jim Lee. One last thing. We've also seen these characters in other properties. Captain Atom was used, as was The Question, a lot in the Justice League Unlimited animated series. Obviously, we saw Peacemaker and Thunderbolt in that TV show. We're getting another version of the Blue Beetle, and we're getting Blue Beetle was included in the Justice League roster in the late 80s and very much plays off Booster Gold, and we know we're getting a TV series of Booster Gold. So let me know what you think. How much do you know about Charlton Comics? How many Charlton Comics do you have? I've actually been kind of picking them up here and there because I figure the runs are fairly easy to complete because they were short. It only ran about 3 years. So let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, you can take a look at a couple of my other videos here. And this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.